we'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm Jeneal Young, a historian at the Great Basin Museum in Delta, Utah.
And my name is Owen Nielsen. I'm board director for Great Basin Museum, and I'm also a historian there. And we're here at this site, a very important location in Utah history. It was here 161 years ago that the John Gunnison survey party was massacred by Pahvant Indians. And the ramifications of that massacre are extensive. And we'd like to talk a little bit about them today. Let me start with a burial party from Fillmore, which is a community about 40 miles in that direction. There was 8 men in that party. Among them was Chief Kanash, the civil chief of the Pahvant Indians. Those Indians were responsible for the massacre. And they arrived here and found 8 dismembered skeletons laying about this area. And they were nothing but bone. They had been picked clean by coyotes and wolves. They pieced them together as best they can. 2 of the bodies were wrapped in blankets and loaded on a wagon, and 6 were buried in a mass grave just off to our right. The civil chief Kanash was able to convince Mishokop and his band to arrive here at this time and tell about why this massacre had occurred. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the scene turned very dramatic. One of the members of the party reported that Mishokop's countenance was a mixture of fiend incarnate with savage affection for his father. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he told how his father was killed by California immigrants over in Meadow. Now, 35 years after this massacre, one of the burial party members came out here, and as best he could figure it out, he thought he located the burial site of the 6 who were buried here. And a cedar post was planted in the ground to mark that spot. Then, 74 years later, another group came out from Millard County, from West Millard, which had been settled in the meantime, and they placed a commemorative brass plaque on this site. But it was extensively vandalized, so a short time later it was taken in, and it now resides at Great Basin Museum. And a steel rail now marks the spot where the burial occurred. So we will now continue the rest of the story and tell you how all this came about. Mormon historian B.H. Roberts called the Gunnison Massacre the saddest incident concerning the Indian troubles of 1853. That was the year of the Walker War. He went on to say, however, that the massacre was in no way connected with the general overall Indian hostilities of that year, nor was it in any way related to the Walker War. It stands as an incident wholly by itself, the result of a California immigrant company's folly and the Indian traditional law of vengeance. A very different view from this was given by federal judge William W. Drummond. He was one of the so-called runaway judges of territorial Utah. Upon assuming his duties in 1855, Judge Drummond immediately declared the Mormon probate courts to be illegal. This launched great antagonism against himself from the people and the local population of Utah. Also, his living with a known prostitute, whom he passed off as his wife, offended the Mormons, almost as much as their practice of polygamy offended him. He tried some cases related to the Gunnison Massacre. They accomplished very little, other than to spread discord throughout the territory. He became convinced that the Mormons were the perpetrators of and probably participants in the massacre. Joining him in this view was the widow of John Gunnison, who went to her grave believing that Mormons were implicated and full participants in the massacre. Gunnison had previously written a book called The Mormons, which was critical of Mormon theology and cultural practices. He believed that Mormon cohesion was a result of persecution and that Mormonism would die a natural death if left alone in its isolated Western setting. Gunnison's widow and some politicians back east read this book, and they came to believe that there was a plot, perhaps originating in high church councils, to incite the Indians against Gunnison. Drummond's prolific writing was in the same vein and added to this belief. The controversy over whether or not Mormons were implicated in the massacre is still with us today. Books are still being written on the subject, but I think it should be pointed out that the earliest accounts by both Mormons and non-Mormons, even by the Indians Kanash and Mishokop themselves, indicated no Mormon involvement. Now, Gunnison was born in New Hampshire and graduated from West Point as an engineer in 1837. He served with the Stansbury Expedition, which mapped Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake. That was in 1849. While in Utah, he became well acquainted with many well-known prominent and not so prominent Mormons and trusted them as they in turn seemed to trust him. In 1853, then Captain Gunnison was appointed to lead a topographical survey to chart a possible railroad route. This was the 38th parallel route to the Pacific. His party arrived at Manti, Utah on October 19, 1853. There he hired Mormon guides to help him with his expedition. Still in October, he arrived in the Pahvant Valley and camped about 6 miles north of Fillmore. Gunnison went into Fillmore to purchase supplies. There he met Bishop Anson Call, whom he knew well from his former time spent in Utah. From Bishop Call, he was informed of a particularly ugly incident that had recently occurred between a party of California immigrants and the Pahvant Indians, the Native Americans of this area. Our story begins with that incident. This was about 2 weeks prior to the massacre. The immigrants were led by Mr. Hidreth. They had been fired upon the night before, and some members of the party had sworn publicly that they would kill the first Indian who came to their camp. Bishop Call had met with them and cautioned forbearance, since most of the Indians were friendly. While the immigrants were camped on Meadow Creek, the Indians did come. The Pahvant war chief, Mishokop, his father, and several others entered the camp to trade buckskin for tobacco and other items. The immigrants attempted to disarm them, and a scuffle ensued, in which an arrow was thrust into the body of an immigrant. Rifle fire followed, and some of the Indians were wounded. The war chief, Mishokop's father, died the next day. Indian justice demanded that retribution be exacted. It didn't much matter whether or not the guilty party be found. Vengeance could be perpetrated on any white man who happened to be in the way. That was Indian custom and tradition. The Mishokop band moved northwesterly after threatening to wipe out the community of Fillmore, but later they decided to find an easier target. Gunnison knew he was in some danger, but winter was fast approaching, and feeling an urgency to complete this part of his survey, he split his party, with Lieutenant Beckwith, second in command, taking part of the group north to explore the mouth of the Deseret River through Lamington Canyon. Gunnison, R.H. Kern, topographer, J. Crutchfield, botanist, William Potter, guide, John Bellows, employee, 1 corporal, and 6 privates, 12 in all, went west towards Sevier Lake. They came to the Sevier River to this location where we now stand. They camped under a willow-covered embankment as protection against the late fall wind. At the break of day, While engaged in breakfast, they were startled by rifle shots and a flight of arrows. One man was instantly killed while Captain Gunnison ran frantically about the camp, shouting that he was their friend. All in vain. The rifle and arrow fire continued. The captain and 7 of the party were killed outright. The corporal and 3 privates who were tending the horses were able to mount and escape. That afternoon, a Captain Morris, previously camped near Fillmore, came upon the scene. The bodies were dismembered and mutilated almost beyond recognition. They stayed through the night to protect the remains from wolves, but left the next morning without interment because of frozen ground. 10 days later, Anson Call and a group from Fillmore, that's the burial party we talked about earlier, buried the dead on this spot, except for Gunnison and Potter, who as best they could be identified and pieced together, were taken to Fillmore and Manti for final internment. Reaction from most Utah residents was sadness and dismay, and can be summarized by an editorial that appeared just days after the massacre in the church-owned Deseret News. It said in part, "We feel to commiserate deeply with the friends of those who have been so suddenly and unexpectedly cut off, but more especially with the wife and children of Captain Gunnison. And we take this occasion to bear tribute to the memory of Captain Gunnison as a gentleman of high and fine-toned feelings, as particularly urbane in his deportment to all, and as an officer having few equals in the service, in the strict, accurate, energetic, speedy, intelligent, persevering performance of duty under any and all circumstances." Today, the final resting place of Captain John Gunnison is well marked in the Fillmore Cemetery. It is easy to locate and worth a casual visit. Now, most famous of those whose bones lie buried here on this site would have to be those of Richard Kern. As well as a topographic engineer, he was also an artist of note from Philadelphia, a product of the Hudson River School of Fine Art. He was also a scientist. He was one of the first to see and to paint the stunning ruins of Chaco Canyon and Canyon de Chelly. He served on surveys conducted by James Simpson, Lorenzo Sitgraves, and Kit Carson, including Carson's disastrous midwinter trek through the San Juans, in which many members of his expedition died from exposure, and some of the dead were apparently eaten by their starving companions. Kearns was a survivor, and he had only recently recovered from this San Juan ordeal. Gunnis sent for him from New Mexico to document the survey expedition. Unfortunately, his illustrious career ended here on that cold November morning. So when you come to visit this site, be sure to pay your respects to Richard Kern. But there's more to our story before we can end it. The strong desire of the federal government to try the murders of Gunnison led to the arrival in Utah of Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Steptoe. After an investigation, he convinced Chief Kanosh to turn over the guilty members of the tribe. 7 were sent, 1 for each of the murdered party, minus 1 for the Indian killed by the passing wagon train. Taking advantage of the Ute legal concept of trading one life for another and eliminating some undesirable and troublesome tribal members, it seemed like a good trade for the Indians. Kanosh chose 4 from among the old, the unpopular, and infirm, who probably had nothing to do with the murders, and 3 who probably did participate. These 3 did stand trial. After the evidence was presented, Judge John F. Kinney told the jury to convict them of first-degree murder, premeditated, or else set them free. The verdict came back: ankle joint, sandy hair, and white tree, guilty of manslaughter, a much lesser charge. The judge was incredulous. The verdict was probably influenced by defense attorney Almond Babbitt telling the jury that these three were the only people, Indian or white, tried for offenses during the Walker War. The jury was swayed and apparently bought his argument. The three were sentenced to 3 years in prison, but soon after they managed to escape and ended up serving very little time at all. The federal officials in Utah were furious. Brigham Young, Indian agent Demick Huntington, and Alvin Babbitt got most of the blame. If Mormon federal relations were not bad enough already, they suddenly got much worse, with criticism, recrimination, animosity, and hatred seemingly from all involved, from both sides. Soon these and other sundry events would come together to cause the federal government to declare war on territorial Utah. Until the Civil War, Utah was the only established territory to be declared to be in open rebellion against its government. The first territory or state to be invaded by an occupying army. It is a strange distinction indeed. Now finally we will end our story. So when you can, come visit us at Great Basin Museum in Delta, Utah, and be sure to visit our website at greatbasinmuseum.com. Thank you for your attention.